Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Manikaran Singh Checker, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of the ICS Wednesday seminar titled China's Environmental Diplomacy and Bilateral Climate Cooperation with the United States and India's Kyoto Protocol. This seminar examines the People's Republic of China's environmental diplomacy with two distinct nations, the United States, a predominant global power, and India, an emerging developing nation. It will investigate the factors that govern Beijing's engagement efforts and elucidate how environmental engagement serves to advance China's priorities of national sovereignty, economic development, socio-economic growth, and international status. In the aftermath of the Kyoto Protocol, China's discourse on climate cooperation underwent a substantive evolution with its ascent to the status of the world's second largest economy and the foremost emitter of the greenhouse gases. It faces a complex and unique challenge at the international negotiations dealing with issues related to climate change. The presentation will also provide an evaluation of the ramifications of China's environmental strategies for India's aspirations as an ascending power within the global south. The speaker for today's seminar is Dr. Shagufta Yasmin. Dr. Yasmin holds a PhD from the Center of East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, focusing on Chinese environmental diplomacy with the US and India from 1997 to 2015. She has also completed her bachelor's and master's in Chinese language and literature from JNU. She was the recipient of ICSHY Multi-Year Doctoral Fellowship from 2017 to 2020 and has conducted research at Central China Normal University, Beijing University, and Harvard Yenching Institute. She has also trained at Shenyang Normal University under a Government of India scholarship. Dr. Yasmin has taught Chinese language at the Central University of Jharkhand. Her publications include an occasional paper, a policy brief for ISC, and a book chapter in the 2023 book Kingdom of Jordan, 100 Years and After, edited by Jamal Al-Shalabi and Nadeem Akhtar. The chairman for today's seminar is Professor Varaprasad S. Dula. He's a professor in China Studies and former chairperson of the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He was an ASIS called Asia Studies in Asia, Asian Studies in Asia fellow at Beijing University in Beijing in 2004, visiting scholar at Shinyao University in 2014, academic mentor to postdoctoral scholars at India China Institute New School, New York, during 2017 to 2019. In 2015, he published a book titled Science and Technology in Contemporary China, Interrogating Policies and Progress, Cambridge University Press. He has also published research articles in journals and chapters in edited books. He has also contributed to Economic Times, People's Daily, The Hindu, among others, and has appeared on CCTV, Shinya News, Lok Sabha TV Beyond, and China Radio International. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I'll now hand it over to your chair, over to you, Professor Tola.
Thank you, Mr. Manikaran Singh. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. And right at the outset, I would like to thank Professor Alkacharya, who had been a colleague for about 27 years at the Center for East Asian Studies. We worked together for these 27 years. And also, this is indeed a double delight for me to be here at ICS. First and foremost is mainly for the theme of environmental diplomacy and particularly environmental concerns. And second is Ms. Shagufta Yasmin, who is going to present the paper, is my doctoral student. And this is, in a way, a very interesting combination of teacher-student being part of this presentation and chairing the session. In the second half of the 20th century, environment emerged as a major issue that necessitated collective and enduring solutions for ensuring sustainable human development and human security. Fortunately, the leaders cutting across all divides from different parts of the world came together and proposed various solutions at a number of conferences and summits, including Montreal, Rio, and Kyoto. This process eventually culminated in a major paradigm shift from Millennium Development Goals that the world, thought about to ensure development for all, to Sustainable Development Goals, where the central thrust is environment and sustainable environment. It is against this larger, context of environmental, diplomacy and environmental strategies that the global community came up with, that we need to look at China's environmental diplomacy. The remarkable economic growth that China clocked in the last 4 decades added a new dimension to global climate change debates and actions. China, as a factor of the world, and more recently, as the largest polluter, had to shift gears in its environmental diplomacy. And when we peruse or when we look at environmental diplomacy, in fact, it is a subset of China's diplomacy, which also went through divergent strategies and policies over the last few decades. And with the recent rise of China, we notice its diplomatic architecture acquiring assertive elements. Some view Chinese diplomacy as Wolf War diplomacy. Of course, it is debatable whether the existing Chinese diplomacy, including the environmental diplomacy, has any component of that Wolf War diplomacy. Therefore, we need to really raise a question whether we observe some facets of Wolf War diplomacy in Chinese environmental diplomacy is a pertinent question that must be pondered over. The 3 countries in the study have distinct and sometimes shifting strategies vis-a-vis climate change. China, US, and India, given their own trajectories of development, and also the domestic component and the international processes. And Ms. Shagufta will unpack for us the complex contours of China's environmental diplomacy with a focus on bilateral climate cooperation with the US and India. And I request Ms. Shagufta to take over.
Is my screen visible?
Shagufta, it's not visible as yet. I think you need to.
I'll share it once again.
Yeah, please do it again. Yeah.
It's visible now?
No, I think yeah, you need. I hope you have opened. Yeah, I think now it's coming. Yeah. Maybe you can go to the first slide.
Yes. It's visible
Yeah,
now?
I think that's
Thank you, Chair, for setting the ground for my presentation. So, good afternoon, everyone. As it's mentioned, today I'm going to make a presentation on China's environmental diplomacy and its bilateral cooperation with the United States and India since the protocol. This is actually a part of my PhD research. Uh, uh, and Okay. So if you look at China's environmental diplomacy, it's China's position at the international climate change negotiations has witnessed a dramatic shift since its participation till the present times. If we look at the Chinese scholarships on the definition of China's environmental diplomacy, we see a focus on safeguarding of sovereignty and at the same time protecting the international environmental interest. However, when we have a close analysis of China's environmental diplomacy, we see that it is highly focused on promoting its own national interest, which again comprises of both the sovereignty and the economic development or the GDP growth. So how this evolution has happened, I won't go much into the historical thing, but when we are talking about China-India bilateral cooperation, we have to look at how China started its participation into the international climate change negotiations. So during the initial phase, China's participation at the international climate change negotiations, we see that both India and China hold a similar view, and they held the developed world responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, and they always had a stern position on not taking any voluntary commitments as such. And the reason that they gave for these have been poverty eradication, because both India and China, they during the 1950s and 60s were going through very hard times in terms of their economic development. Both the countries had large population who were below the poverty line, forget about at par of the per capita GDP of the developed or the Western world. So poverty eradication was one major factor which both India and China used in order to not make any voluntary commitments towards the greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing that they highlighted is that modernization and economic growth are the priorities for both the countries, and therefore they are not going to put their modernization and economic growth at a position where it will suffer due to making any kind of commitments. However, both the countries during the initial stage of participation at the international negotiations highlighted that transfer of technology and funds is necessary if the West wanted China and India to participate more efficiently at the international climate change negotiations. So, however, despite of these commonality in the position of both India and China during the initial phases of their participation, we see one thing which was very different in case of China from that of India is the issue of skepticism of China, which it had on the issue of environmental degradation. And China viewed it as an infringement of sovereignty and it believed that the West is using the pretext of environmental degradation and emissions, greenhouse gases emissions in order to restrict China's economic growth. Now, this is striking because this can be seen as a reflection of China's position of this can be seen as a reflection of the century of humiliation which has shaped China's relationship with the Western world for decades. And even today, many policy documents highlight the century of humiliation when they talk about China's relationship with the West. This skepticism of China was further strengthened by the Senate Resolution 98, which was passed by the 105th Congress in 1997-98, during the same time when the Kyoto Protocol was formulated. And this resolution actually highlighted and declared that the United States should not be signatory to any protocol to or any other agreement regarding the UNFCCC at negotiations in Kyoto and thereafter. And secondly, it also highlighted that no commitments or limit to reduce greenhouse gases for Annex 1 countries as a result, which would harm the US economy in a serious manner. So this resolution actually, strengthened China's skepticism towards the whole topic of use of environmental degradation or the greenhouse gas emissions by the West in order to restrict China's economic growth. Now we see that in 1999, that is just 2 years after the COPs that happened in Kyoto, we see China taking a position of Pu Piao Thai, that is no voice for the flexible mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol. And China took some time to actually understand the whole flexible mechanisms and clean development mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol, and then it took a stand after knowing that it can help China in its economic growth, and also it would provide financial assistance by the Asian Development Bank and other institutions. And finally, China agreed to the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. However, it is also said that one of the reasons why China did not participate actively during the earlier times was that it actually avoided the international monitoring, which was a part of the flexible mechanisms during that time. Now we also see that as the clean development mechanism was understood by China, we see how proactively China participated, and this actually projects. This is a projection by the UNFCCC, which shows how actively China has participated in the CDM projects, which shows that almost 50% of the CDM projects are hosted by China till 2022. And the second country which is the host to the CDM projects is India. So both India and China have been able to use the CDM mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, what we see that during the early years of 21st century, China had already reached a considerable amount of its economic growth, and the way China was moving ahead with its development, its carbon dioxide emission rate, and also the per capita GDP had risen. As a result, there was pressure from the West to come out with some kind of voluntary commitments, at least on the topic. However, we see we can say that in order to get rid of or to soften the Western criticism of China not taking any voluntary commitment, the 10th five-year plan was for the first time when China mentioned the term of climate change. However, during this time, there was no mention of emission intensity or any plan on carbon emission reduction. The use of climate change in this 10th five-year plan was only to show that China acknowledges this issue and its affirmation of active participation in global environmental issues, and that it would contribute in the negotiations of the climate change. Now, in 2005, a renewable energy law was formulated and the National People's Congress passed it, which set renewable energy targets for the first time and established the feed-in tariffs for the renewable energy. However, in the 11th five-year plan, that is between 2006 and 2010, this was the first time when we see the introduction of binding target in the for the energy efficiency. That is, first, to reduce the energy intensity by 20%, and second, 15% of the primary energy should be from the renewables. So here we see a shift in China's old position of not making any voluntary commitments. This is a kind of a reflection that China is making some kind of voluntary commitments which suits its own interest. These the two data that I have actually show that China is on track of these commitments which was made at the 11th five-year plan. That is the 20% reduction of energy intensity, and secondly, the use of renewables and the 15% of the primary energy source. So now again, we see that China and India have collaborated substantially, which led to the formulation of the Bali roadmap, and it ensured that the Bali roadmap in 2007 was in concert with the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. And just after this, we also see that the United States, which has not been a part of the Kyoto Protocol, tried to collaborate with China on the sidelines, and all through the multilateral forums like the Major Economies Process on Energy Security and Climate, and the Asia Pacific Partnership on Clean Development and Climate, also known as the APP. Now, what we see that also in June 2008, we see that the US-China established the 10-year framework on framework for cooperation on energy and environment. Following this, there were lots of companies, green tech companies from the United States who were flocking towards China, and there was a collaboration, intense collaboration between the green tech companies from China and the US. China and India both also worked together during the Copenhagen Summit in 2009, which brought together developing countries under the umbrella of the BASIC, where Brazil, South Africa, India, and China were part, which helped them to broker the Copenhagen Accord. And the coming together of this strong grouping can be attributed to one of the major incidents which has not been highlighted by many scholarships. However, I think for me, I feel it was one of the major impetus which led to the strengthening of the grouping of developing countries under the umbrella of BASIC. This was the incident of the Danish text leak. The Danish text was an informal document which was formulated by Denmark, and it was supposed to be shared with other developed countries. And this document undermined the negotiations at the UNFCCC and handed more powers to the developed countries. This, owing to this Danish text leak, the entire climate change summit at the Copenhagen was left in disarray. However, in 2013, we again see China and India, along with other developing countries, rapidly growing economies, coming together under the umbrella of like-minded developing countries. These were the countries which were emerging economies and in the rampant development path. So this actually included more of the countries, because BASIC had fewer number of countries. So India and China kind of expanded their reach to the developing countries through this like-minded developing countries collaboration. Now, after 2013, we see a divergence in the position of India and China. We see that in the run-up of COP15, China, with many other countries, had already declared mitigation obligation, which left India in isolation. The situation was further complicated when in 2014, China and the US came out with a joint statement. And China actually committed to peak its emissions by 2030. Following these developments, we see that China's position has changed from the past position of the 24 character tongue strategy of Thao Quang Yanghui, that is hiding one's time and biding one's capability, to becoming a major player in the international climate change negotiations. By 2016, China became the largest green bond market. And under the leadership of Xi Jinping, we see that China's language and posture at the international climate change also seems to have more like a firm, uses more firm language. For example, the use of shared future for mankind, which is Ranlei Mingyun Kongthong Thi, or even domestically at the 19th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping said that on the issue of climate change, China is ready to take a driving seat. This showed a major shift from its traditional position of kind of shying away from taking the position of a leader on the issue, even on the issue of climate change. So when we look at Sino-US cooperation, we see that in China prefers bilateral relationship vis-a-vis US. Why? Because one, it is always felt that China you can use this bilateral relationship to have more control over their relationship, and also it provides it to it leverages its position and allows it to gain more out of this bilateral cooperation. There have been instances, for example, when the former Treasury Secretary Paul Hank, he said that China has always been able to do what it actually wants to do, and for the United States, it has not been able to convince China to do things which is of the American interest. Now, this is something which the United States has always felt in terms of Sino-US cooperation on the issue of climate change. There is a complex relationship between China and United States on the issue of climate change, which has been formulated as a result of historical, posture, competition, and also the domestic politics. Now, what we see is that China has also been able to, convince United States to adjust its behavior and on various terms. For example, when Beijing launched its Made in China 2025 plan, it had focused on renewable energy and electric vehicles at the core, and also stated that China would overtake the United States in the field of technology power. However, to this retaliation or to the reaction, we would say that the United States, when it came out with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 in the United States, which makes single largest investment in China climate and energy in American history, enabling the United States to secure the position a world leader in domestic clean energy manufacturing. This made China very uncomfortable, and it filed a complaint at the World Trade Organization. And eventually, the United States had to agree to China's request of entering into the consultation. Furthermore, we see as tariff war deepens between China and the United States, China launched a yuan-denominated sovereign green bond at the London Stock Exchange. This can be seen as an attempt to deepen its cooperation with the European Union and the United Kingdom. as China sees that there has been two instances where China was left nowhere during these international climate change negotiations and the bilateral, because when Obama, she came out with the joint statement in 2014, and just after that, when Trump 1.0 came to power, most of the deals were just non-functional, as the Trump administration pulled America out of it. So I think China is through these sovereign bonds is trying to deepen its cooperation or looking for a new market in the European Union and the UK. However, yeah. So in case of India, Sino-India cooperation, we see again they have a very complex relationship. The reason is, of course, most of us are aware of it, border dispute. Another is economic competition. And for me, I believe personally that language barrier creates a major problem in mutual understanding between the two countries. Now, what we see is that in case of India, both India and China have used the multilateral cooperation of G77 plus China and BASIC to leverage their position at the international climate change negotiations, and also to evade any kind of unwanted commitments that has been put over them by the international community. However, what we see is that the issue of vulnerability is something which really uh, strengthens the cooperation between India and China. Both India and China have vast and diverse landscape, which includes the Himalayan region, the river deltas, the landlocked cities, deserts, and the coastal regions, which has most of the economically developed cities. However, the issue of climate change threatens the threatened by the melting of permafrost, floods and heat waves, desertification and sea level rise. Again, brings out a new avenue for India and China, and it makes it imperative for them to cooperate on the issue of climate change. The concerted efforts by both the countries have enabled them to come up with the intended nationally determined commitments, which has helped them to further their domestic interest, their national interest, and also show them, both of them, at the international climate change negotiations as the responsible stakeholders. Now, if we look at, so what can we, summarize out of the two sets of cooperation that we saw in the presentation? First, we see that China has used both these sets of bilateral cooperations to further its national interest of safeguarding sovereignty and economic growth, and to strengthen its position at the international climate change negotiations. China has adjusted its own position and also influenced both India and the United States to do the same. However, these two sets of cooperations has enabled the low carbon transition in all the three countries, and also in other nations of the world, due to China providing cheaper green technologies to the world. And therefore, there are still many reasons, no matter how many times US administration tries to pull itself out of the international climate change negotiations, and the China and the United States enter into tariff wars, or India and China go into the hiccups of the relationship, we see there are still many avenues on the issue of climate change which ask them to cooperate. The most recent one that has come up is the carbon capture and storage, which is seen as an imperative technology, especially when the three countries have come up with their carbon neutrality plan. And if these plans are to be fulfilled, carbon capture is necessary. Only the bringing down of the greenhouse gases is not enough. And for this CCS, or the carbon capture and storage technology, we need a collaboration between India and China, where there is a transfer of technology, and also where China can provide cheaper technologies to the world, and also to United States and India. So with this, I would just say that if there are suggestions and questions, I would love to take them. And I hope I have been able to, cover up the topic in the given time.
Thank you, Ms. Shagufta Yasmin, for that interesting, exposition on China's environmental diplomacy, with a focus on its bilateral climate cooperation with the United States and with India. One being a developed country, the other one developing country. How China, which is somewhere in between in some sense, has been trying to navigate through the various processes and stages of the global endeavors to find endurable solutions for the global climate concern. Yeah, thank you for that. Quite interesting. And now I shall open the discussion with the questions from the audience. Yeah, and before Manikaran reads, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, who is here with us. He's been a pillar of strength for many of us, these second and third generation scholars, and now the fourth generation scholars. Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, good afternoon. Hope you are doing well. Yeah. Yeah, now we will take the questions from the audience. Yeah. Yeah, Manikaran, would you like to read that, the first question?
We have a question from Nazar Khan. It is asked that if you, Dr. Yasmin, if you think that the purpose of China's environmental diplomacy is to justify its growing carbon dioxide emissions.
Should I answer?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think please go ahead as we wait for the other questions. Yeah.
No, that was maybe that was not actually the point that I was trying to make. China is using its environmental diplomacy to promote its economic growth. But at the same time, as we see, there is a shift, because it's not China is not working in isolation. There is international criticism. There is bilateral relations, which there are pressures from bilateral relations which push China to take its position as responsible stakeholder. So definitely it's not that China is trying to justify its emissions through its environmental diplomacy. Of course, China is still the main priority of China or any other country would be economic development, more than trying to mitigate the climate change issue. However, it's not the case that China's environmental diplomacy is trying to justify its emissions. Thank you.
While we wait for more questions, Dr. Yasmin, I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
We have seen that during the recent inauguration, after the recent inauguration of the Trump presidency, US has again retracted itself from the global climate policy stage, and the stage is there's a vacuum there. Of course, there is Europe, which is trying to do its best, but there's a certain vacuum. Do you think China is the second largest economy and one of the largest manufacturers of the green equipments and equipments which are necessary for the green transition? It would be trying to fill this void, and to what extent it might go in the near future?
Uh, you see, for me, I believe that although once during his domestic speech, Xi Jinping used the term of taking the driving seat. But if you look at China's position on the issue of climate change, we would not say that China can fill that vacuum which has been created by the United States. However, what we can see that China is proactively trying to portray itself as a responsible stakeholder, and at the same time China can play a major role in bringing together of other economies, for say we can say the coming together of south cooperation, maybe like bringing of India and China, which we see that in recent times the China is promoting the south cooperation on various fronts. So climate change can be one issue where the South-South cooperation can result in filling up of that vacuum which has been created by the United States, not China alone, I must say.
I have a follow-up question. Sorry, Professor.
Please go ahead.
We saw that during the initial years of the BRI, it was more or less, especially in the energy sector, it focused on petroleum and coal power plants. So, but there has been some changes in the recent years. So, will you like to elaborate on that? That how the things have moved from the carbon-intensive sectors to the green transition phase of
In
the.
case of BRI, what I personally feel is that BRI has been something which has caused more harm to China in terms of climate change negotiations or its position on the, because first, India is not a part of BRI. So definitely it has created, some kind of tension between India and China, and the way China has used BRI to promote its own, economic interests through BRI. And secondly, as you said, that China is trying to promote its green technology and things, but the way China has, pushed the usage of coal power plants through the BRI, this whole plan, I think it has caused more harm to China, and it would take a lot of, energy and efforts for China to get back or to reverse that criticism which it has already got from India and other countries. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. You have a question from the chat. Professor Manoranjan Mounty, would you like to...
Just a quick...
please go ahead.
Thank you.
And then we'll take the question.
Excellent presentation. Now, you seem to use the term national interest only as achieving economic growth and, of course, defense of state sovereignty and rising status of the country and so on. Why can't national interest also be reconciled to or reconceptualized as sustainable growth rather than just high rate of growth? In other words, you are posing national interest as something which is only through very high rate of growth and no matter what consequences it has for environment and energy and so on. I know, most countries' leaderships have that understanding. High rate of economic growth is needed. Greater military power and industrial power are the index of national interest and so on. But I think we have to reconceptualize national interest in terms of both growth as well as sustainability and environmental considerations. Another question is, in case of India and also in Latin America, particularly Brazil, the social movements have been very active. Of course, in Europe also, Scandinavia particularly, which are demanding both globally as well as of their own country to take more steps. What is the situation during Xi Jinping era? Has the NGO sector, the social movement sector, been active on the environmental field? Are they visible in the COP meetings to the same extent that Scandinavian NGOs and Latin American NGOs are visible? Thank you.
So, sir, to your first question, yes, of course, sustainable development has been promoted by China as part of its environmental diplomacy. When, especially during Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, when they took to power, there was a time when China was going through tremendous economic growth and at the same time facing domestic criticism of environmental degradation. I think that is when China, under their leadership, has promoted the sustainable development as its goal, and also used it at the international climate change negotiations to show its proactiveness. So definitely it also adds to the national interest. And secondly, to your question about the social movement role, China is a very interesting case if we look at the social movements or the environmental NGOs, because as we know that protests of any kind cannot be and has not been very rampant in case of China. But one thing, and that is why their participation openly in terms of like the Scandinavian countries, I don't see that it is happening or will happen in future. However, one thing is very striking, that domestic criticism is one thing I think which China takes very seriously, as it threatens its social stability domestically. So for the case of Beijing, there was a time when Beijing was going through the serious issue of PM 2.5 and PM 10 pollutants, environmental pollutants. And the residents they were not on the streets. However, some would post pictures every day of 365 days showing that they could not see blue skies. And if we look at how Beijing has tackled the issue of air pollution, although being the capital city of China, we see that China has done a tremendous job in tackling the environmental pollution in cities like Beijing and Chongqing. So that is why I feel that no matter, even if the environmental NGOs are not visible at the international negotiations, sitting on the sidelines of the government, however, we see there is an impact of domestic criticism, and Chinese government takes it very seriously. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. There is one question from the chat box. Manikaran, would you like to read that?
Yes, we have a question from Payal Jain. She says that the current times show that the international treaties, laws are not being respected. So, do you think that we need to redefine these international laws and treaties?
See, I think it's not the problem is not with the international laws and treaties. The problem is with the execution of those laws and the treaties, and especially in the case of climate change, I would say that it's the willingness of individual nations which is more important. Because you see, climate change is not something which is going to impact other countries. It's also going to impact your own people. For example, what I raised about is vulnerability, which brings China and India together. No matter how much they have issues, however, the issue of climate change, the environmental degradation is something which, if it is going to affect your own people, it's the question of the willingness of the nations as such, and it's not the international laws or treaties. Because you see, through my presentation, I have tried to make a point that India, China, and other developing countries have been able to, play their role in the formulation of different treaties during different times, like the Kyoto Protocol or, the Paris Agreement. So it's not, the problem does not lie with the laws or the treaties. It's how we are trying to use it, how serious are we with these laws and treaties. That is the most important thing. So
Dr. Yasmin, I have a kind of a suggestion and a question regarding this environmental catastrophe that we are facing, because as it has been rightly termed uh, emergency, many countries are doing various experiments, and they have their own experiences, as you rightly put out there, uh, and their willingness to how to cope with various issues that they are arising. So, do you see a possibility of a public database kind of a thing in which these nations can share their experiences, and what kind of successes or failures, or what was the various things that they learned during the experiences of various experiments that went into it? For example, you were talking about how China was able to go a long way in addressing its pollution problem. India and various other countries in South Asia and around the world can learn from that. If it would be available in a public database, which is free to access, it would go a long way to address the various issues we as a world, as humanity, are facing today. So, do you have certain
you see,
thoughts, comments on it?
for China, I believe, as I said, that the environmental NGOs are not visible. Their protests are not visible. That is why, putting, because if you even look at the policy documents of, how China has tackled its pollution problem domestically, you won't see the role of civil, participation or the environmental NGOs, because that is something which China would never allow the outside world to know that there has been some pressure. It's always that China tries to project that it is in its own interest, and that is why it has done what it has done. So having, like, of course India can learn from it, but rather than having a platform like that, there are other means where India and China can collaborate, like, and especially in my thesis, in fact, I have pointed out that it is one of the opportunities for India and China to cooperate, that is knowledge sharing. No matter there is a language barrier, but knowledge sharing is something which can enable India to learn a lot from China and vice versa. So of course there is so much, and both India and China have so many issues which we face, which are similar, like the issue which of air pollution in the capital city. Even in Delhi we are facing the same thing. So of course, and knowledge sharing and such collaborations are needed. However, bringing them to any such kind of platform where China would allow things like that to appear for the outside world to see, I don't think that is possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Manikaran, for those questions. Let's listen to the questions from the others. Akshat, Maine, and others. Poonam Suri, we've got several of them. I would encourage young scholars to come up with very reflective questions. Yeah? Yeah, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself and then ask. If there are no questions, as maybe some of you may be thinking about asking questions as you take time, let me come in here maybe with a couple of questions. Shagufta, what kind of a impact that SDGs have had on China's diplomacy and also its environmental policy. Do you see some kind of a positive impact, that SDGs have had on Chinese environmental diplomacy? If so, what kind of impact is that, and to what extent that has, shaped Chinese environmental policy within its domestic context, as well as its diplomacy in the larger, North-South debates? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, of course, the SDGs have played their role in formulating of China's diplomacy internationally and also has influenced the domestic policies on the topic. I think the way China used the CDM was one of the reasons of the SDGs, and that has encouraged or pushed China to promote the use of renewable energy and green technologies, and to cut down its reliance on coal for energy uses. And secondly, it also helps China to go for, bilateral collaboration, particularly with countries like US, where emission reduction and green technologies, and also, coming up of, low power grids which have lower, wastage. So these kind of collaborations has actually been possible as a result of the push from the Sustainable Development Goals. And therefore, both internationally and domestically, the policies on the climate change issue has been, shaped in China, and really has a powerful impact on China's environmental diplomacy and also at the domestic level, the domestic policies.
A more recent development that we've seen vis-a-vis President Trump's tariffs. What do you think of the way in which these tariffs are going to affect the environmental, issues and also climate change and diplomacy?
So one thing that really is striking is the issuance and the launch of sovereign green bonds, which is yuan denominated. And it has been launched at the London Stock Exchange. Here, China is actually trying to sideline its, reliance on the United States for green technologies and its cooperation on the issue of climate change. And I think China is very tactfully trying to, because this is the second time where the United States administration under President Trump has put China in a very tough spot. So China has realized that it has to look for an alternative partner to cooperate on the topic more efficiently. And I think it's a very smart move for China to come up with a yuan-denominated sovereign green bond, which it has launched at the London Stock Exchange, which is going to promote its, ambitions of energy transition and also the carbon neutrality. And I think in future or in coming few months, we are going to see more of such kind of initiatives by the, Chinese government.
Professor Alka, would you like to come in with some comments and reflections?
While we wait for Professor Acharya,
there are a couple of questions.
There are questions in the chat box. Akshat Mane is asking, he's a research assistant here at ICS. He's asking, to what extent is China's environmental diplomacy shaped or influenced by its broader strategic interests in the region, such as Africa?
Africa is something, but yes, because I mentioned about BRI and I have touched upon BRI as part of my thesis, I would say that not China's environmental diplomacy, I wouldn't say is shaped or influenced, but I would say that of course it has some, it has some influence, like China's relationship with the African countries has some influence on its environmental diplomacy. And of course, the way China is, promoting its economic interest in the African countries, it actually it is facing international criticism, and at the same time, I think it encourages or pushes China to to add that green touch to its influence in the African countries and come up with more, uh, low carbon transition kind of development in the African countries, which I think would again provide a global, a global influence of China's environmental diplomacy through its relationship with the African countries. So I'm not an expert on Africa, but this is what I feel through my, touch upon of the BRI, which I had earlier also mentioned. So
Nazar Khan asks if you would like to name one or two Chinese figures who have influenced China's environmental policies significantly in the last 2 decades.
like the question mentions about Chinese figures, like the Chinese leaders, or
Uh,
Yeah, maybe you could
you can
talk about both leaders and scholars
you
or
see, again,
policymakers.
the thing is, if you look at Chinese leadership, especially after the coming of Xi Jinping, I mean, you won't see much of individual people coming to the limelight. It's always Xi Jinping who takes the focus. I mean, even the Geneva, the talk that he delivered in Geneva, which had the Ranlai Mingyun Kong Thong Thi, that is shared community with community with shared future for mankind. So I think it's always the Xi Jinping who is going to take the the lead and also take the credit for, especially if you're talking about the recent few years or the after the coming of Xi Jinping. Of course, before that, as I mentioned, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao's administration has done a good job in terms of sustainable development, and it shaped China's domestic policy and also influenced China's environmental diplomacy. So
thank you, Dr. Asmi.
Yeah. Any more questions from others who haven't asked any questions so far? Supradip Das, Farah, Govind, or Mahek, I would encourage you to ask some questions or make some comments. Yeah, please go ahead. Even as they, keep thinking about the questions, let me come in again. Yeah, Shagufta, technology is a double-edged sword. In fact, it can cause pollution in some ways, but at the same time, it can also be a source of solution. So given that, particularly vis-a-vis environmental issues, how do you read Chinese commitment towards factoring technological solutions to address environmental challenges in its domestic context as well as in its diplomacy? I think there are two components here. This can be seen only in terms of the increasing investment in R&D. Of course, China is really leapfrogged in its investment in R&D, but what percentage of that is actually being focused on environmental issues? That's number one. The other one pertains to China's energy basket. If you really map the trajectory of China's energy basket, it is still heavily skewed towards coal, which constitutes about 60%. And China has to really bring it down substantially to make the goal of sustainable development a reality. So what are some of the major steps that China is thinking about to reduce coal use in its industrial manufacturing process? Yeah.
So as you rightly pointed out, of course, and in case of China, I think China has been criticized a lot on how it has used the clean development mechanisms and the technologies. I mean, just being a producer of the largest producer of green technologies or solar panels or wind power, equipments doesn't make you a responsible stakeholder. As you mentioned, there is a large chunk of, energy which still comes from the coal. Almost 60%, and the renewable energy source is just being used for less than 20% of the energy requirement. So of course, China is facing lots of criticism on this. However, as we see that in the international climate change negotiations in the past few years, the use of nature-based solutions to counter the climate change, uh, impact is something which has come up. And I'm sure that China is also going to, as in the past, we have seen how China takes time, reads to the, international climate change negotiations, and then, comes up with its policies. I'm sure that the nature-based solutions is going to be a positive, have a positive effect on China's climate change diplomacy, and China will have to shift its stance on the way it is using its green technologies, and it will have to take more responsibility than just by manufacturing green technologies. I think nature-based solution is one thing that in the recent few climate change negotiations gives a very positive kind of or I must say optimistic view towards the international climate change negotiation, which is not only going to benefit the economically developed or aspiring economies, it is even going to develop the least developed economies, because nature-based solution is somehow going to add to afforestation, which will again, and even the issue of carbon capture and storage. This is something which China will have to think very seriously on how it is going to bring down what it has already emitted into the atmosphere. So these are the few things which China will have to take seriously in the coming future. And looking back at China's track at the international climate change negotiation, I feel that it is going to happen maybe in a few years. And secondly, what you mentioned about so what was your second question? Energy basket. I think I addressed it.
Yeah. One pertains to the composition
Yeah.
of
So of
coal
course
consumption.
it will have to, because again it is always highlighted that China's reliance on coal. China is still heavily reliant on coal for its energy. So that China will have to address, and just having 15% or 20% of its renewable sources for the domestic energy needs is not going to be enough if you really want to show yourself as a responsible stakeholder.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any more questions from the?
No, sir. We do not have any questions for now.
Professor Alka, would you like to come in and say a few words? You're there. If Professor Alka doesn't have anything, let me make some concluding remarks before we end the session. In fact, there seems to be, a strong and robust correlation between, China as the factor of the world and China now emerging as the largest polluter. In fact, its manufacturing capabilities in some ways led to this kind of a process. So therefore, it is in this context that China has to really revisit, its developmental architecture, basically trying to focus more on sustainable development, not just development, but sustainable development. I think there has been some kind of a move in that direction, especially with its green budget way back in 2008, and then thereafter, China has been investing. But given the extent of the contribution that comes from China to global pollution, I think China has to invest more substantially to make sure that environmental concerns are addressed at the global level. And even as we grapple with climate change and environmental diplomacy, we need to keep in mind and the framework the millions of environmental migrants and refugees. According to the World Bank and even European Parliament, there are roughly 32 million environmental migrants. In fact, in addition to these 32 million migrants, we have the poorest of the poor, and the most marginalized are the ones who are worst affected whenever we have natural calamities. And therefore, the global community in general and China in particular must pay close attention to these most vulnerable communities that suffer maximum when natural calamities strike them. And of course, these natural calamities are precipitated by the kind of industrial development and the consumerist lifestyles that we are leading. And this begs the question as to how we are going to really revisit our development paradigm. And in this context, Ernest Schumacher's profound proposal when he said small is beautiful resonates. I think it's still ever more relevant to abide by, particularly when it comes to evolving sustainable solutions to addressing climate change. And another question that we need to ask is there anybody out there listening to the cry of these millions who are suffering? And let's hope the leaders and the civil society, as Professor Manoranjan Mahanti quite rightly pointed out, the impact of social movements, particularly environmental movements that try to make the global issues of environmental pollution as a major concern. And let's hope that we will move in that direction. And we would also see that the global community would take the SDGs more seriously and ensure that we have a better environment in the years to come. So with that, we end today's interesting presentation on China's environmental diplomacy. Yeah, thank you. Over to IC's team.
Thank you, sir. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank Professor Dola and Dr. Yasmin for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen.